Today, we are going to talk about a topic I find fascinating: how the U.S. is changing by the numbers. We all talk a lot about the growing diversity of America and the growing inequalities, but often in the abstract. So we want to put some numbers on that, and we're going to do it with an expert. Olivia Martin is the research manager at USAFacts. USAFacts is a nonprofit, nonpartisan civic initiative that aims to make U.S. government data easy to understand. They are a content partner with News Not Noise, and they sent Olivia to help us make sense of some of the numbers. I thought we could start sort of with the big picture. We all know that the American population is growing more diverse and changing in various ways. Can you give us a little bit of texture, and in what ways are we changing?
So I think one thing that's important to note, and when we talk about how the population is changing, is it's not growing as much as it used to. For example, just last year, before the pandemic, we had the lowest population growth rate since 1918. So it'll be interesting to see if that even goes negative this year with the pandemic. But we have seen over the past 10, 20 years, seeing that immigration is playing a larger role in our population growth. For example, in 2019, immigration made up 38% of our population growth that year. So that kind of population growth has an impact on what our country looks like. I think we all know that our country is getting more diverse. I think a lower proportion of our country is white, and larger proportions are Asian, Hispanic, African American. And I think we also see that more of our country is made up of people who were not born here, who are in fact immigrants.
So I want to drill down on that for a minute, because when I was preparing for this, I was sort of surprised to see, given all the focus on immigration currently and perceptions that there's a lot of immigration at the southern border, and what you just said, you'd think that we were at the maximum level for the percentage of our population that is made up of immigrants. But I found out that that's not true. Previously in our history, a greater percent of our population was made up of immigrants compared to today. When was that, and what was different?
Yeah, so I mean, in 1910, actually, it was 15% of our country was born not in the US. They were born somewhere else. We're basically back at that at 14%. But I think there's a perception in our country that, like, oh my gosh, we are at heights that we've never been at before in terms of immigration. And actually, we've been higher. We're just, over time recovering from this point, I think in the 70s or so, when we were about 5% immigrants. So I think the people and where they're immigrating from is different than it was in the 1910s. It's a different set of countries, more from Asia, a little less from Europe. But the fact that our country is a nation of immigrants is something that's been true throughout our whole history. We're just seeing ourselves returning to that in the numbers.
Let's talk a little bit about how we're living. I know we've been talking since I was a little kid about how the types of families are changing, that there are single moms and dads. But that's kind of holding steady, isn't it? The number of single moms and dads. What is changing?
Yeah, so that you're absolutely right. Something that is changing is you're seeing a swap. There is this classic, like, prototypical American family in the 50s and 60s where it's like married parents has kids, right? And that used to be like 40, 50%. In 1980, it was about 30% of households looked like married parents' kids. And now that's dropped to 18% most recently. And what's shooting up is this single person, no kids. And so actually, over the past 40 years, an increasing percentage of Americans are living alone. It used to be only 8% of people that lived alone, and now it's 11%. And this might be a trend we see continue to rise, especially as it becomes, people's income. It's expensive to have children. So I think what it means to be a family in the United States has really changed a lot over the past few decades.
It's so interesting to me because when I was little, we were all talking about the end of the nuclear family, that there's single moms and dads, and it's moved in another direction. What you're saying is that people are staying alone their whole lives.
Yeah.
So that's not just a reflection of more young people being on their own. It's adult people choosing to be on their own without kids.
Yep, it is. Yeah, it has a lot of impacts on everything from, how we deliver benefits to people, how we calculate what a household's income is. If more people are living alone, that has an effect on household income. It's been an astonishing trend to watch.
We'll get back to that in a moment. I'm going to take a turn to a slightly grimmer note to talk about how we're dying, because obviously in light of COVID, that's a relevant topic, especially now. The preliminary data shows the 2020 death rate was the highest it's been since 1943. And I'm curious, two things. Is the 2020 increase attributable to COVID deaths? And then what made so many people die in 1943?
So your first question, I think COVID is, a significant factor here. What drove us to do this analysis was we kept hearing people say, all the people who died of COVID in 2020, like they would have died anyway. So our death rate's not going to go up. But if you look at it, our death rate went up significantly just from 2019 to 2020. About like 8 or 9 people per 1,000 died in 2019. That shot up to above 10 per 1,000 in 2020, which might not seem a lot, but if you compare it to over time, we have not had as high of a death rate as we did in 2020 since 1943. And that's not particularly because 1943 was like such a disastrous year. I mean, it was. We were in World War II. The US was involved. People were dying. It was terrible. But it's really more of a reflection that like over 80 years since 1943, we've been making steady progress as a country. Fewer people dying, new treatments to diseases. And in 2020, because of how bad COVID was, it's like we lost those 80 years of progress for a year just because of how serious the toll of this disease was.
So our healthcare system and our ability to provide effective medical interventions really skyrocketed in the 80 years since 1943 until COVID really took its toll last year.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Okay. I do want to ask you about the 1918 flu pandemic, because everybody's always making comparisons, obviously, between COVID and the 1918 flu. How does our death rate compare to the death rate then?
So that is one data point that definitely was higher. In that year in 1918, about 14 per 1,000 people died, whereas it was about 10.3 in 2020. So yes, it definitely was higher. I still don't think that's like a win for us, because that we knew so much less about medicine then and so much less about public health now. So it's not too comforting to me, but it was certainly a higher death rate in 1918 than now.
That's a good nuance. Okay, let's switch gears a bit to talk about the American dream. And I think there's nothing considered more conventionally American than finding your way into the middle class. So I'd love for you to answer a question I always struggle with. How do you define middle class in America?
I think there are so many valid ways to define the middle class. Here at USAFacts, we're data people, so we took a very quantitative, trackable thing to it. So what we define as the middle class at USAFacts is the middle 20% of income earners. So what that means is that if there are 100 people living in the United States and you rank them from biggest income to lowest income, and then you grab the 20 people right in the center of that list, that would be the middle 20% of income earners. So every year, because our incomes are changing, especially at the bottoms and ends of that distribution, what it takes to be in that middle 20% changes. For the most recent data we have from 2017, using data and tax records from the IRS, to be in that middle 20%, you earned between $33,000 and $66,000, which is always surprising to me, because I feel like I always have friends on both sides of those spectrums who say they're middle class, which is valid. But if you're taking a statistical approach on it, that's what the middle class looks like to us at USAFacts.
And that would probably vary by where you live and rent.
Absolutely.
Prices where you live, right? But that's sort of just if you take the aggregate numbers. So is this kind of the dark ages for the middle class? I ask this because I've looked at some of USAFacts data, how you've crunched the numbers, and it looks like the middle class currently has lost ground compared to where the middle class was a few decades ago.
Yeah, this is one where context really matters. At USAFacts, we always try and provide the context to look at the issue in different ways. I mean, one way you can look at the issue, just looking at, for example, wealth, of households. If you look at middle class households compared to, say, 1990, their absolute wealth of those households, adjusting for inflation, has grown 66%. So you might look at that and be like, maybe the middle class households are like doing better than I thought. But then at the same time, you can also look at it in the context of overall American household wealth. And if you look at it that way, about how much of this pie is that middle 20% of earners getting, you actually see that in 1990, this group, the middle class, used to own 12% of wealth, which is still not great considering they're 20% of the population. And now they own 7% of all wealth. So that's not the most positive trend. So it's all relative. I think there's ways in which you can see that the middle class is definitely getting crunched when you look at their relative wealth.
And just to stay on that for a moment to help people understand, when you say the middle class owns 7% of the wealth, I mean, that really speaks to the fact that the very wealthy control so much of our wealth in this country. And it's the middle class might be moving ahead slowly, but the 0.1% or whatever it is just rapidly accelerating.
Exactly. That's it. It's just that everyone is growing, but some groups are growing at just such different rates. And part of that has to do with the types of things that, wealthy people are invested in versus what middle class folks are invested in.
Can you say a little more about that?
So I think one thing that we find in the data is if you look at, this average middle class family, again, this middle 20%, wealth is basically made up mostly two things. One, the home. This is like the classic American asset that makes up a large portion. And the second thing is pension assets. So both of those are like very solid investments, not always the most risky things, typically, especially pensions are, typically more conservatively invested. Then you compare that to what does it look like if you, the portfolio of someone who's in the top 1% or the top 20%. That wealth is much more diversified, much more likely to be in things like ownership of businesses, ownership of mutual funds and stocks. And that's where you see this explosion of growth, especially since 1990, but also just since the Great Recession. You've seen growth rates of like over 100% in some of these asset types. And so it's kind of just a cycle. You have more money, so you're able to invest in some of these more profitable, more risky assets. And in return, that enables you to become wealthier because you have those types of assets.
Let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's talk about race. According to USAFacts data, as I understand it, white people own about 86% of the nation's wealth, despite making up only 60% of the population. So what drives that?
I mean, there are just so many factors in this that include, differential educational access, differential access to jobs that return a lot. One point I'd love to make is, we just talked about what an average person's wealth is, and a big part of an average person's wealth is the home. And I think one thing we have learned a lot about at USAFacts is just how there have just been these structural barriers for Black Americans for decades, as recently as, later into the 20th century, preventing African Americans from owning homes. So most recent data I was looking at said that, the white home ownership rate is about 73% still, and the Black home ownership rate is about 42%. So if you're thinking of that, the home is just like the classic base form of American wealth that you pass on to your kids and helps them get a little bit wealthier. Well, that's just an asset that has been prohibited to many Americans for many years. So I think that is a key part of the story. There are so many other aspects that I would love to dig into more in the data.
Well, let's do that another time. I want to move on to talk about gender, because there is a big gender gap, and medium income, and we can't talk about wealth, I understand, because it's so hard to separate out who owns what wealth when it's a two-person household. I get that. So we have to look at income when it comes to women and how they're doing compared to men. Median income for women in the US is $14.9 thousand less than the median income for men. I am not shocked to hear that, but can you explain why? And does that hold true across industries?
So I think I saw this and trying to be a data person, I tried to explain my way out of it, trying to look at structural barriers, and you can kind of see that. But there's really, I think I'd say, three things to this. One, I first thought maybe women just work differently than men. More women, choose to have children and things like that. And it's true, women are much more likely to work part-time than men, which does contribute to a lower income because they're working fewer hours, some of them. And also, there's also the data that shows that women are less likely to be in the most high-paying roles. For example, chief executives are much more likely to be filled by a man than a woman. Software developers, much more likely to be filled by a man than a woman. But then what really shocked me is there is data provided from the Labor Department that shows you for the exact same occupation, for controlling all full-time workers, no part-time mixed in, you consistently see that for the same position, that women are paid less than men for that same position. So one example is for chief executives from most recent data, that women in those types of roles earn 76% of what their male counterparts earned, both full-time employees. Lawyers, pretty similar figure, around 72% of what their male counterparts earn. So it's really not just these structural things about how women are choosing different roles to fill in. It's really, even you get to the same role, you're both full-time, you're seeing an earning differential as well.
That would make a good slide. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So interesting. We're going through a lot. I feel like we can come back and do each of these in more depth at a future time. I want to kind of ask the obvious question, which is COVID has really altered earnings and lifestyles over the last year. So what has COVID's impact been on sort of American wealth?
Well, on wealth, actually, we haven't seen a large impact yet. Again, I think because these pensions and homes are kind of more, protected assets. Where we have seen this impact is really in unemployment. There's really been, I think, inequalities have just been so exacerbated by the pandemic, which is, kind of common to what we saw during the Great Recession. So a few examples of this is that I think in general, the story is that people who are already struggling more, got hit even worse. So we looked at the occupations that are already the more lower paid occupations, for example, food preparation workers, administrative support. Those were the occupations where you were most likely to lose your job, even though you were already in the lowest paying role. And bonus, those occupations are also occupations that tend to be filled more by women. So I think gender is one aspect of the story. Income is one aspect of the story. I think race is just a critical aspect of the story. So not only did, Black and Hispanic Americans come into this pandemic with higher unemployment rates than, white and Asian counterparts, but the increase in unemployment rates was just greater for Black and Hispanic Americans. And it was the worst for Black and Hispanic men in particular, if you just look at the drop in employment. But what I was interested to see is I've been hearing all about this about women. I'm sure that it's been bad for them as well. And you don't see that in the unemployment as much because it's hidden by the fact that so many women have dropped out of the labor force and are not even actively looking for jobs in the way to be considered to be unemployed. So that was just shocking to me to see just really how many Black and Hispanic women in particular have dropped out of the labor force. But, gender is not enough because you actually compare women dropping out of the white women dropping out of the labor force compared to white men, they've actually had almost the same, dropout rate. So it really needs to be looked at the intersection of both race and gender when trying to understand this differential impact.
Leave people with a cause for hope. Is there one? Are trends improving on any front?
Yeah, I think there are trends that are improving. Every month we are adding jobs back. We're still, not at the pre-pandemic level, but every month I think people are getting new jobs, getting hired back, which is so good. I think the other bright spot is I think we're vaccinating people at a rate that we didn't expect we'd be at. We're almost 2.5 million doses being given out a day. Before we'd been thinking we'd get hit 50% of the population not until late in the summer. We may hit that early May. So I think that's been just really hopeful to me in the data that we've really done better on that than we originally anticipated doing at this point.
Yay, two causes for hope. Well done.
Yes.
Before you go, would you just explain to us, how do you know what you know? What do you guys at USAFacts look at, and how do you crunch all this information?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we do what we do is because we found out the government data is a mess and it's so it's not accessible. And so what we're trying to do at USAFacts is take these nuggets of information that are in these giant spreadsheets or, God forbid, PDF documents from the government, and we keep track of them. Because I don't think the average citizen, has the leisure to look through 70 government agencies, which me and my coworkers do every week. We're that 65th one, the BLS, they're supposed to have something this week. So we love that. We nerd out in it, but we realize that, not all of active citizens have the time that we do to go find and pull and show this unbiased government data to folks. So I feel so honored to have the privilege of trying to make that data more accessible and get it into the hands of more citizens.
I'm so glad you do what you do, because I love that I know you guys and I can message you sometimes and say, know these numbers, because there must be a number that says this. And you guys are, yes, it's here, or no, it's not. Somebody has answers. I love it. Well, thank you for your time today and your work always. And I would love to do this again. I think it's super interesting.
Great. This is so fun, Jessica. I love to be back. Thank
Okay.
you.